I've been baking homemade bread for quite a number of years, and while my recipes and techniques and styles have changed and evolved over the years, one thing has stayed pretty much the same, and that's how I let my dough proof or rise. And that's pretty much at room temperature sitting on a counter. But I know that there's bakers, both amateur and professional, that use some manner of proofing appliance. That is something that provides a little more heat than ambient air in a room to help the dough rise either faster or better. And I've never really done it that way. Room temperature has always worked great for me, in my opinion. But I guess I don't know what I don't know. And I've noticed that on a couple of my, small appliances, they have settings on them for dough proofing, and I've never used them. My big dehydrator, it has a dial to adjust the temperature, and there's a little grid that shows what temperatures work best for what things. And there's a dough rising setting right on there. Then I've recently got one of these multi-function toaster oven contraptions, and there's a million settings on that, one of which is for dough proofing. So it got me curious and got me thinking about doing a little experiment in which I make 3 simultaneous loaves of bread in the exact same way with the exact same recipe, but I rise them in 3 different ways. Room temperature on the counter, the dehydrator, and the toaster oven. So that's exactly what we're doing here today. We're going to do everything the same way and for the same amount of time, and just observe the differences between these different, methods of proofing the dough. So I guess let's get right into it and start making some bread. Here we've got all our bread ingredients, measured out and organized into 3 separate but identical batches. For each loaf, we've got all-purpose flour, a mixture of whole milk and water, yeast, dough conditioner, sugar, salt, and room temperature butter. And to make sure we do each step of all 3 loaves at practically the exact same time, I've got 3 KitchenAid mixers here that will be mixing and kneading in tandem. The first step is to bloom our yeast. So after heating up that water-milk mixture to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, I'll pour the 3 containers into the 3 mixing bowls, followed by the yeast. A quick stir, and now I'll leave this all alone for about 10 minutes until the yeast in each bowl is looking nice and foamy, at which time I'll add all my flour, then dough conditioner, salt, and sugar. Now I'll get all 3 mixers going on medium speed, and I'll let those go for 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, I'm throwing in my room temperature butter, and then resume mixing on medium speed for another 8 minutes. When the kneading is done, I'll stop those mixers, pull off the mixing bowls, and get all of the dough from each one transferred out onto a floured surface. At this point, the dough is quite soft and sticky, which is what we want. But if it's too sticky to even touch, go ahead and pat a little more flour into it as needed. I'll take each lump of dough and form it up into a ball, tuck the sides underneath, give it a bit of a turn against the counter, whatever you gotta do to make a decently smooth ball shape. Now I'll spray down 3 identical bowls with some cooking spray, and I'm dropping those balls of dough into each one. Then I'll cover each bowl with a piece of aluminum foil. At this moment, all 3 dough balls are identical, but that's going to change very shortly because it's time for our first rise, and here's where our 3 different methods come into play. For the first dough ball, I'll let it rise the same way I let pretty much all of my dough rise, in a bowl sitting on the counter. The second dough ball will be going into my dehydrator. I've got all the trays removed, so in goes the bowl. The little chart near the dehydrator control shows a setting of 110 degrees Fahrenheit for rising bread. That seems pretty high to me, but I've never actually tried proofing dough at that temperature, so that's what I'm gonna do. The third dough ball is going into my toaster oven, air fryer, multi-function cooker appliance. And it's got a specific setting on it for proofing dough. Its default temperature at that setting is 94 degrees, so that's what I'm going with. This also seems a little bit high to me, but what do I know? Now I just have to let them all rise. To really be able to see the difference between how each one rises, I'll have to let them go for the same amount of time. Since I know my countertop room temperature dough needs an hour, that's what I'll be proofing all 3 of these for. So we'll pick it back up in 60 minutes. Okay, it's an hour later, so let's take a look at our dough. Right off the top, I can see that our room temperature dough and the toaster oven dough are looking pretty similar, but that middle bowl, which was in the dehydrator, has clearly risen quite a bit more. And when I lightly touch it, the dough feels like it has somewhat of a slight skin to it, which is definitely not ideal. But let's punch down these dough balls and form them up into our loaf shapes. So back onto a floured surface they each go. I'll flatten each one out, patting in a little more flour as needed if the dough is sticking too much to my hands or the counter. I'll grease my bread pans with the same cooking spray, roll and form my dough into a nice tight loaf, or at least as tight as possible considering how soft and supple this dough recipe tends to be, and into the greased bread pan it goes. Once all three are loafed up and put into the pans, I'll once again cover each one with some aluminum foil. I usually use plastic wrap for this, or even just a towel, but since I'm putting them into heating appliances, I don't want to risk anything melting or burning. Now, as before, loaf number 2 is going back into the dehydrator, loaf number 3 is going back into the toaster oven, and loaf number 1 will remain on the counter, and we'll just let these rise for another hour. Okay, one more hour later, and let's see what we're dealing with. The room temperature loaf is looking quite nice, and pretty much exactly how I expected. The dehydrator loaf is looking, well, not great. It has clearly risen way too much, and the dough is absolutely spilling over the side of that bread pan. Loaf number 3 is also looking pretty good. No real complaints there. It's clearly risen a little more than loaf number 1. But let's take a closer look at number 2. This is absolutely ridiculous, and I've never seen dough rise this much. It's basically collapsing under its own weight at this point, and I'm all but certain that this loaf is not going to turn out very amazing. But in the name of science, I will still go ahead and bake it along with the 2 other loaves. So into a 350-degree oven they go for about 45 minutes, or until the internal temperature is 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Alright, baking is finished, so I'm pulling them out. In line with my expectations, loaves 1 and 3 are looking quite nice, while loaf number 2 is pretty much a disaster. After letting them cool just long enough that I can handle them, I'll go ahead and pull the bread out of the pans to let them finish cooling. And now we can really get a look at how screwy that middle loaf came out. Yes, I left that big drooping mess of dough in place when I baked it. I thought it would help illustrate how over-risen it really is. And I'd say that is more than apparent as I break that whole overhanging hunk right off of there. At this point, loaf number 2 might not seem too especially messed up, aside from the deformed top and light-colored side. But after letting them fully cool, we can finally cut into each loaf and find out for sure. And I'm gonna start with number 2, just because. While my objective is a light, airy, soft loaf of white bread, this takes it way too far. The crumb inside is closer to a cotton candy consistency than that of a bread, and the loaf begins to sort of just fall apart as soon as I begin cutting into it. I can't even cut a thick slice without the whole piece practically disintegrating. Dehydrator or not, this has basically turned into a demonstration of what happens to bread if you absolutely, utterly, and preposterously overproof it. So I'm just going to go ahead and clear this mess right off of my cutting board so we can focus on the other 2 loaves. Loaf number 1 is exactly as I expected, since this is the method I normally use. And loaf number 3 is also looking and feeling quite nice. The crumb is very similar, as is the overall loaf's squishiness. What's interesting to me is that though the toaster oven loaf rised a bit higher during the proofing phases, the room temperature loaf actually seems to have sprung a little better in the oven. I think that speaks to the fine balance of things that's at play in bread making. If you let it rise too much, then the oven spring won't be as good, and you can actually end up with a smaller loaf. So this is from the loaf that was proofed at room temperature. This is from the loaf that was proofed in the toaster oven. And we're not even going to bother with the loaf that was proofed in the dehydrator because it obviously did not turn out very well and is pretty much just falling apart as soon as I try touching it. As for these 2, they came out very similarly. I would say that I think I prefer the room temperature rise just a little better. For whatever reason, there's a little nicer of a color on the crust, and I think the crumb just came out a little more to my liking. That being said, they're both very soft and pretty close to the same texture and consistency. Obviously, the exact same flavor. And while the one from the toaster oven kind of looks like it has a nicer crumb to it, It's actually slightly more crumbly than the room temperature version. I like my bread to be a little more on the spongy and stretchy side than the crumbly and fall apart side. So again, that's just another point for doing it the way I've always been doing it. And before someone inevitably nails me on the obvious flaw in this whole experiment, let me speak to it. The purpose of using an appliance to heat your dough while it's proofing is surely to make it proof faster. And in my experiment, I did all three methods for the exact same amount of time. For the dehydrator version and the toaster oven version, I probably didn't need to let it rise as long as I did. But A, I don't know how long I should have let it rise for if heating it while proofing. And B, I wanted to really get this visual of the difference in how that bread acts in these different environments. And if I let the two heated versions go for a shorter amount of time, then I don't really know that I'd be able to observe that difference the same way. That is to say, in a real life application, would I stick my dough into the dehydrator and let it go an entire hour and then let it go another hour? No, probably not. So yes, I guess in that case, I essentially wasted that loaf for the sake of this experiment. But to me, that's valuable information to have. I know that in that dehydrator, the bread is gonna rise way too much and probably way too quickly. The toaster oven rises more, but not an insane amount. And it really gave me a feel for these sort of upside versus downside values of each method. And ultimately, I don't know that any of the versions will or could create a loaf of bread made by me in this kitchen that I'll enjoy more than doing it the way I've been doing it, which is letting the dough proof on the counter. So I think that's the way that I'll continue doing it moving forward, unless for some reason I'm extremely short on time and I simply don't have the schedule to let a loaf of dough rise for a couple of hours. If that's the case though, I probably wouldn't start baking a loaf of bread at that particular time anyway, but whatever. Anyway, I guess that's about it. And if you want to see my super soft white bread recipe that I often make, I'll put it in the video description below. And be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future bread making and food experiment videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon, where there's a lot of additional and bonus content posted weekly. Just go to patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.